How to replace the pressure gauge on a Breville dual boiler espresso machine. Here I have the 900 model. I believe this process would be the same for the 920, though I haven't worked on a 920. I think the only difference between the two machines is that they have those two valves at the bottom that you can access right about there that allow you to drain the boilers manually so that you can, or drain them from the bottom so you can descale the machine yourself. This machine's not meant to be descaled by the user. You can in fact still do it. I mean, at the service center, the same way they do it is you've got to drain the boilers manually. I'll cover that in a separate video. It's actually not that difficult to do. It's time consuming and a bit of a pain, but certainly can be done at home. I will also add though that when you're working on this machine, as soon as you pull the cover off, I mean, you're dealing with standard household voltage, 120 volts, 110, 120 volts. You're dealing with water pressure above 200 psi potentially with the 15 bar pump. And on top of that, it's, you know, brew temperature 200 degrees, boiler temperature above that, well above 200. You got hot water here. Be extremely careful. If you're not comfortable doing this work, just frankly don't. Not only can you hurt yourself, but just take a look in the machine in the back here. These parts are incredibly fragile, very easy to break, lots of opportunity for things to go wrong in here, for you to snap wires or plastic fittings. It's not the most robust set of parts. However, pretty cleverly packed into this unit, and honestly, people have kind of knocked the Breville dual boiler machine based on the choice to go with parts, a lot of plastic in here and whatnot. But frankly, you know, it works, and you get a lot of features and pretty solid performance for the price. So hey, you can't expect to have stainless steel braided hose and you know, large boilers for this price. Okay, so back to the gauge. Before you even consider replacing your gauge, be absolute certain that your gauge is in fact a problem. Easy to check that. What you have to do is measure the pressure at the portafilter. That can be done a number of ways. What I've done here, you can go, ideally, borrow a portafilter that has a gauge built in that you can just borrow for a day, try it out, run the pressure on the machine, confirm it with your Breville gauge, and to do that, just take the single serving dual wall filter basket is what I was using. Stick in the cleaning disc that seals it off. Put that in your portafilter, lock it in the machine, and then use the manual button to run it for, you know, say 20 seconds till you hit max pressure, and that will tell you what your machine's what it's set at. In my case, like I bought this machine secondhand, couldn't get it above 7 bars. I was fairly certain that after I descaled it, I dislodged some calcium and it went into the gauge and was blocking and restricting it, so I was actually getting the pressure, I was just reading low. However, after I pulled the gauge out, I realized that wasn't the case. So don't do what I did. Before you even consider pulling this gauge out, confirm that it works. But confirm that it doesn't work. Now, so how to do that? I rigged up a fairly simple and inexpensive pressure gauge here to the existing Breville portafilter. What I did is I removed the spout. If you haven't done this before, they're quite often thread locked on here. Mine didn't appear to have any thread lock on it. However, still very, very tight to get off. What I suggest doing, you got to heat it up. Helps a lot. Run boiling water through your portafilter. Hit it with a heat gun, not necessarily blowtorch. You want to discolor it, but a heat gun will be enough. And then you got to pry off this, or turn off, unscrew this spout. To do that, you know, use a long screwdriver. You can get a lot of torque on here, and then just carefully with a lot of pressure, put force on it till it'll snap, and then you'll be clear. Just be careful not to break your spout. Now, after you've done that, as it turned out, it's not so simple to get from these threads, which are a non-standard thread, to some standard pipe fitting that you can get a gauge on. Just as a side, this gauge is just a standard hardware store gauge, 200 psi. Only trick is it's designed for cold water, so you got to make sure that when you're using it, you fill the filter basket with cold water, and I even put some ice cubes in there when you're brewing, just to make sure you don't damage your gauge after the first use. Okay, so because these aren't standard threads, I had to rig up some method of getting the gauge attached. Just so it turns out that the hole in the portafilter fit the 1/4 inch. This is a standard 1/4 inch potable water hose, high pressure potable water hose. You'll see these on water filters or on fridge lines supplying the ice or the water maker, ice maker or the water dispenser. It just so happens as well that this little fitting squeezed in here really nicely to help create some extra pressure and holding force for that hose in here. That's standard fitting for this type of hose. It's about an inch long. You can see the end of it protruding out. So I pressed that in, tapped in with the hammer, ran it to some other standard fittings that got me to just standard pipe fittings. Is actually garden hose that got me to my gauge. Stick that in and confirm that what you're reading on your Breville gauge is in fact the same as, or isn't the same as it is on the hardware store gauge. Hopefully it is, and I say hopefully it is because you do not want to have to replace the gauge on this machine. I've done a fair bit of work on this machine over the last few weeks here, and this is the most difficult and task or part that I've replaced. It is also the one that is probably most likely to break something else in the unit, particularly the wiring. You got to be extremely careful when you're doing this. And that said, you may have to do it. If you do, I'm going to walk you through quickly how to go about it. This gauge is fairly cheap. I think it's January of 2018 here when I'm making this video, and this thing is still available for about 20 bucks. So not an expensive part. It's just fastened on to this bracket, a couple of bolts there, the nuts on it, and that's all there is to it. Tricky part is getting this thing out, and that is difficult because there's just no room to get this thing out. So I first looked at this and said, no problem. I'm going to pull the brew boiler out, loosen the 3 screws, take the 3 screws off of the gauge mount, and then pull it back right through this hole. However, that doesn't work. That doesn't work because that hole is obstructed by both of these 2 black housings, and those are the electronics housings. You can see it really well from the front that protrudes into the hole, as does this one from this side, which means your gauge cannot push through the back of the machine. So it has to come out the front. How we get it out the front, as you can see, I've removed it off of the mounting plate, and in order to do that, you have to be able to access these 2 nuts, as well as, when you're removing it, the 3 screws that go in there. And there's just no way you're accessing that stuff with the even with the boiler removed. You can't access them. You just don't have enough remote. You'll see right down here where my finger is, the metal bracket around the boiler, that housing that supports the boiler, that obstructs this screw from coming out. It just won't come out. You have no choice but to remove the front panel, which is why this task is particularly tricky and really introduces a lot of risk for damaging these wires, especially these 2 right here that are just 2 little wires wrapped in through here. You've got to be extremely careful when you get this loose. As an aside, if you do, for whatever reason, have to remove this brew boiler, actually not hard at all. Just 3 screws, one right there, second one right there, and the third one right here. You remove those, it comes off of this stainless steel ring. It's underneath it, and the whole boiler will come loose. To get it completely out of the way, you've got to remove the hoses, remove the probe connections. Then it'll come out, but it is still fixed in by this blue wire down here that actually is soldered onto that thermistor. So you can only move it a little bit out of the way. Still allows you to get in there and work, but to get it completely out of the machine, you would have to desolder that joint down in there. So how do we get the gauge in and out? Front panel. Loosen these 2 screws. There's only 2 that hold this in, and then this whole panel will come up very gently. It's in a tongue and groove assembly along the bottom. Really hard for me to show that on the camera, but right down here at the bottom, the whole, you can see it right there a little bit, the whole area has this tongue and groove fitting where it presses itself into the bottom. You can see it over here a little bit as well. So you have to loosen that, and the only way to loosen that is by applying force underneath. You're going to push up somewhere around here very gently, because the last thing you want to do is have this thing shoot up on you and break these 2 wires. It will require a fair bit of force to get it loose. Once you have it loose, as I have here, it doesn't come up very far at all. You can only get it up maybe 1/4 of an inch, just because you're restricted by all this bundle of wires. What you can do though is you can pivot it, and I removed, you can see here as well, I removed this connection just to give myself a little bit more access to that hole. Real easy to put that back on. Just goes right here afterwards. So you pivot this whole front panel up. Once you've done that, now you have some room to work. Now you can take your gauge, you can put your gauge in from the front, which gets past the obstruction here and here. You then take your mounting plate, put your mounting plate in from the back. It's going to use both hands. It's going to be frustrating and tricky, but you will bolt it, bolt that gauge back on. Once you've got the assembly mounted, it will be loose in here, and then you're going to have to access those three white plastic features where the screws go in. One at the bottom, with my fingers on, second one right here, and then a third one right here. Once this is tilted up, that's how you can access all those screws. Just impossible to access until you have loosened the front panel and lifted it up. Putting the hose fitting back on once you've got the gauge screwed back in, installed, it's actually the easiest part here. You just have your standard Breville fitting here, which goes to this nipple and the common little orange O-ring that they use all over the place in this machine. You just squeeze that on and then reinstall your clip. That's all there is to it. If you made it that far, then you're in good shape. If everything's working, obviously plug it all back in, fire it up to make sure you haven't disrupted anything along the way. Make sure you put everything back that you took off, of course. All right, so that's it. That's replacing the pressure gauge on a dual boiler machine. I hope you never have to do it, but if you do, certainly hope that this video has provided some insight and helped you out a little bit along your way. Good luck.